May 3rd, 1945. Zone 9, 40 hours. A converted Wehrmacht supply depot on the outskirts of Kassel, Germany. Steam clung to the corrugated metal roof, turning the air above the concrete floor into a hazy, sour mist that stank of carbolic and damp wool. Bare light bulbs buzzed overhead. Outside, a generator coughed and rattled. Inside, boots scraped and M1 Garand slings creaked as the American guards shifted their weight. Liesel Braun stood in a thin, striped dress, arms locked around her ribs so hard her nails bit through the fabric. 20-odd women pressed close at her back, their breath hot and sharp with fear. On the far wall, a row of pipe-fed shower heads dripped steadily onto the stained floor. The rusted fixtures looked too much like nozzles. "Raus! Schnell! Let's move it, ladies!" a corporal barked, his accent Midwest flat, his words battered into rough German. He jerked his thumb toward the showers. "Delousing! Orders!" No one moved. "We won't bathe in front of men," Liesel heard herself say, voice hoarse but clear. English, the words from propaganda leaflets and officers' orders, rose up unbidden. Not again. A silence fell, dense as smoke. Somewhere a dog barked. A canvas curtain snapped in a draft from the open loading bay, letting in a slice of cold spring air and the faint smell of coal dust and wet earth. Lieutenant Jack Ellery shifted his helmet, the liner squeaking against sweat-damp hair. He glanced from the trembling women to his squad, to the clipboard in his hand with Med Inspection, female POWs typed neatly at the top. "Fine," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Then we'll do it another way." He turned toward the open bay door where, waiting uncertainly with a wooden crate and a mason jar of cloudy lye soap, a middle-aged American churchwoman clutched her coat tighter around a faded floral dress. 8 weeks earlier, near Paderborn, Germany. The house had once belonged to a lawyer, Liesel decided. The parquet floors and high, echoing ceilings were too fine for a village inn, and the carved banister still smelled faintly of beeswax when her hand slid along it. Now, blackout curtains swallowed the daylight, and Wehrmacht boots had worn a dark lane down the middle of the corridor. She paused outside the parlor door, smoothing the thin silk of the borrowed dress over her hips. The fabric caught on the rough skin of her fingers, cracked from too much lye and too little cream. Behind the door came the low murmur of male voices, the clink of glass, a burst of laughter that ended in a cough. Someone stubbed out a cigarette. She smelled the sharp, cheap tobacco through the gap. "Braun," the matron's voice snapped like a switch. Frau Kehl stood at the end of the hall in her gray dress and steel-rimmed spectacles, an iron cross ribbon pinned in careful defiance at her throat. "You will smile tonight. Oberleutnant Reuter is promoted. Do not give him a reason to complain." "Yes, Frau Kehl." The words tasted like sawdust. In the parlor, a gramophone rasped out a waltz. Liesel stepped inside, the heat from the coal stove wrapping around her like a damp blanket. Officers in field-gray tunics lounged in armchairs under a yellowed portrait of Kaiser Wilhelm, collars open, belts unbuckled. Their peaked caps, with silver eagles and cockades, lay in a careless line along the sideboard next to empty bottles. Oberleutnant Reuter looked over as she entered. His new ribbon bar glinted above his breast pocket. "Ah, our Betreuungsfrau," he said, the official term twisted into something private. "Come, sit. The front moves, but we must keep up morale, eh?" She smiled the way she had learned, lips without teeth, eyes not quite meeting his. The waltz scratched on, needle catching, then righting itself. Outside, distant artillery thumped, dull as a hand against a door. The first siren began low and far away, a wavering note that rose and steadied. Conversation faltered. Glasses paused halfway to mouths. Reuter swore under his breath. "Another drill," someone muttered. The second siren joined the first, nearer, urgent. The gramophone needle skated off the record with a hiss. Liesel's skin prickled beneath the silk. She knew the rhythm now. Siren, searchlights, the sky over the town pulsing with flak. A Feldwebel burst in, greatcoat unbuttoned, field cap askew. "Order from Corps," he panted. "All non-essential billets to evacuate. Russians in the east, Americans in the west, no reserves. The house is to be cleared. Women on the trucks in 20 minutes. Frau Kehl's face did not change. "You heard him," she said, already turning. "Pack what you can carry. Papers, only what is necessary. Move." Liesel stood for a heartbeat longer, watching Reuter fumble for his tunic, metals clinking. The siren wailed, higher, closer. Then she went upstairs, back past the beeswax banister, to fold her life into a small brown suitcase. The truck smelled of petrol, cabbage soup, and fear. Liesel wedged herself between two other women on the bare wooden slats, knees knocking as the vehicle lurched over ruts. Canvas flaps snapped in the wind, letting in slices of gray sky and the occasional sting of cold air. "Keep your head down," whispered Anja, the girl from Cologne, clutching her small suitcase as if someone might snatch it. Liesel already had her chin to her chest, dark hair tucked under a borrowed kerchief. She kept her hands folded in her lap, fingers still and obedient. Invisible, she told herself. Just another shadow on the truck. If the Feld gendarmerie forgot they were here, all the better. Up front, the driver ground the gears. A Wehrmacht Gefreiter stood on the rear step, one hand gripping the canvas, the other resting on his Karabiner 98K. His eyes slid over them now and then, unreadable. Somewhere ahead a motorcycle revved, then settled into a steady growl. The first explosion came from the fields to the left, a dull thump that lifted a curtain of earth and smoke. The truck jerked as the driver braked hard. Women cried out, clutching at one another, luggage thudding to the floor. "Yabos!" someone gasped. Fighter bombers. Liesel heard the rising snarl of engines overhead, higher, faster than she knew from pre-war civil flights. The Gefreiter shouted to stay down, his voice cracking as the second blast hit the road ahead. Shrapnel pattered against the truck's side like thrown gravel. The convoy scattered. A staff car slewed into a ditch, its officer passengers spilling out and running for the tree line. Another truck ground its gears in reverse, trying to turn. The air filled with the stutter of flak guns from somewhere behind them. Too late, too far. Their engine coughed, sputtered, died. The truck rolled to a stop at the side of the narrow country lane. The driver climbed down, cursing, yanking the hood open. Steam billowed up. "We can't stay here," the Gefreiter shouted toward him. "Get it moving." "It's finished," the driver snapped back. "I said finished." The argument crackled like static. Liesel watched through a gap in the canvas as a line of soldiers jogged past, gray coats flapping, not even glancing at the truck full of women. One tossed away an empty bread bag. Another limped, boot sole flapping. No one stopped. "What will they do with us?" Anja whispered. "Maybe another truck," Liesel said, though she heard the lie. Without escorts, they were nothing but stray cargo. Easy to leave, easy to forget. The engines in the sky faded. For a moment, there was only the tick of cooling metal, the distant calling of crows in the fields. Then another sound rolled up the lane, a deeper, slower rumble that made the ground itself tremble. A shape crowned the low hill ahead, resolving out of the haze, a squat, broad-nosed tank, its turret turning with lazy confidence. Sunlight caught the big white star painted on its olive-drab flank. Behind it, more vehicles followed. Half-tracks, jeeps, another Sherman, all marked with the same star. "Amerikaner," someone breathed. The Gefreiter stepped back from the tailboard, eyes gone flat. For a heartbeat, Liesel thought he might raise his rifle. Instead, he pulled his belt tighter, glanced once into the truck, at them, at their thin coats and paper suitcases, then turned and trotted toward the ditch, vanishing into the hedgerow without a word. A jeep rolled forward, brakes squealing. A young American in an open helmet stood up, one hand on the windshield frame, the other gripping a rifle. "Hände hoch!" he shouted. Then again, haltingly, "Hands up! Kaput Krieg! Finis!" The women stared. Posters had shown the Ami as thick-necked brutes, jaws like bulldozers. This one's jaw was dust-smudged and needed a shave. His eyes, under the steel rim, were just tired. Slowly, Liesel raised her hands. Around her, arms lifted like pale branches. The road to nowhere had ended. Not in rescue, not in any place she understood, but in front of a white star and a boy with a rifle who looked as uncertain as she felt. They herded the women into a rectangle of wire and canvas on the edge of a larger camp. The sign at the gate read PW enclosure, the letters crooked on whitewashed board. Inside, the ground was churned mud and straw, slick under Liesel's borrowed shoes. A khaki tent sagged nearby, ropes humming in the wind. From within came the dry clack of typewriter keys and the murmur of male voices. The smell of damp canvas, coffee, and wet wool hung low over everything. Liesel cradled a tin mug of something hot and thin, soup, or maybe just water that had thought about meat. Steam warmed her face. Her stomach ached with a hunger that felt older than the day. "Braun, Liesel," a voice called, mangling the vowels. "Next, kommen Sie." She stepped toward the tent, Anya squeezing her arm in passing. At the entrance, a military policeman in a helmet stenciled MP held back the flap. A white brassard with the same letters wrapped his sleeve. He gave her a quick, embarrassed glance, then looked past her as if she were smoke. Inside, a field desk balanced on ammunition crates. A portable typewriter rattled on top, manned by a corporal with sleeves rolled and fingers stained with ribbon ink. Beside him, an officer in a slightly better pressed jacket leafed through a stack of forms. His silver bar glinted at the collar. First Lieutenant. "Name?" he asked without looking up. She gave it. The corporal hammered keys, the metal arms snapping forward. "Civilian, military, camp follower," the officer went on, consulting a German language questionnaire that didn't quite match the English on his form. Liesel hesitated. "I worked for Wehrmacht," she said. "House for soldiers, Sonderheim." The corporal smirked, just once. The officer's jaw flexed. His eyes flicked up to her face, then away. He wrote something in a cramped hand. "Betreuungsfrau, C-note." He flipped open a small booklet, dog-eared and underlined. "Geneva, 1929, he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Females, protection, special categories." The words sounded like furniture being moved in another room. "So she's PW or what, sir?" the corporal asked. The lieutenant sighed. "Call it female POW internee, special case. Keeps everybody happy." He signed with a blunt pencil, then stamped the paper so hard the desk shook. A second copy was rolled into a cardboard tube marked Castle Depot. Liesel watched the stamp come down, watched her life flatten into lines and codes and a destination she had never heard of. For a moment, the reduction was a relief. A paper problem could be filed, stacked, forgotten. Paper did not leer or touch. "Next!" the corporal barked. Outside, the wind tugged at the wire, making it hum. Liesel stepped back into the mud, clutching a slip of card with her name and a number typed in neat black letters. She was colder than before, but at least now the war had given her a category. Where they sent that category next was no longer up to her. The Castle Depot sat in a shallow bowl of land, a web of wire and huts pressed between a railway spur and a line of low trees. From the back of the truck, Liesel saw the watchtowers first, square silhouettes with sandbag skirts and the dark stick figures of sentries outlined against a low sky. Beyond them, an endless geometry of fences and walkways. The gate swung open with a rasp of metal. A sign in English and German announced PW Camp, U.S. Army. Inside, the ground was a gray paste of mud and cinders that sucked at her shoes. A whistle shrilled, sharp as a slap. Men in mismatched uniforms, Russian, Italian, German field gray turned almost brown with dirt, shuffled in loose ranks toward a central square. Appell, murmured one of the women automatically, but this wasn't German roll call. American sergeants with clipboards and carbines strode along the lines, barking names, numbers, orders. Everything was louder than it had to be. They were shepherded sideways, through a gap in the wire, into a smaller compound tacked awkwardly onto the main grid, like an afterthought. Two low barracks faced each other across a strip of churned earth. A single latrine trench, half-heartedly screened by tar paper, sat at the far end. "This is for us?" Anya asked. "For now," a GI said in rough German, shrugging. His helmet rode low on his forehead. The chin strap hung loose. "Frauenlager, you behave, no trouble." Inside the barrack, the air was thick with damp wood and fresh-cut pine from the rough bunk frames. Olive-drab blankets lay folded at the foot of each mattress, still smelling faintly of the depot. Dust, mothballs, something chemical. Liesel ran her fingers over the coarse weave, the foreign texture. That night she lay awake listening to the camp breathe. Somewhere a man coughed and coughed, a dry, tearing sound. Trains shunted on the spur beyond the perimeter, couplings clanking, whistles low and mournful. Boots crunched on gravel during patrol change. Morning came with another whistle. A young American medic in a wool sweater and a helmet pushed back on his head stood in their doorway, flanked by two MPs. He held a clipboard in a metal box stamped with a red cross. "Inspection," he said. "Sanitary." He fought with the German words, then gave up and used gestures, hands to hair, to seams of clothing. "Lice, bugs, understand?" They understood. They lined up, shoulders bare as he checked scalps, the women flinching more from memory than from his gloved fingers. When he reached Liesel, he paused, frowned. He parted her, hair with a wooden tongue depressor, then scratched something on his form. "Infested," he told the MP next to him. "Most of them. We need a full delousing and shower cycle today. Otherwise, we'll have typhus on our hands." The word shower went through the room like a draft. Liesel felt it in her gut, cold and deep. She saw tiled rooms from Wehrmacht clinics, cold hoses, the way doctors' eyes had slid past her face. She heard, too, the muttered stories traded late at night in the Sonderheim about camps further east, showers that were not showers. The medic snapped his box shut. "Set it up," he said, ASAP. As the MPs moved off, the women sat back on their bunks, rubbing their arms where the cold had raised gooseflesh. Outside, a train whistle blew again, long and low, as if the whole camp were exhaling. Liesel stared at the knot in the floorboard between her boots and tried not to picture nozzles in concrete ceilings. They came for them after midday chow, when the thin stew had barely settled in their stomachs. Two MPs appeared at the barrack door, silhouettes against the pale sky, rifles slung muzzle down on worn leather straps. "Offstein," one called, then switched to English, louder. "Up, move it. All ladies to bathhouse, now." The word snagged in the air. Bathhouse. Around Liesel, bunks creaked as women rose. Some already had coats clutched to their chests, as if fabric alone could shield them. Anya's lips moved silently, counting something. Steps to the door, perhaps, or prayers. Outside, drizzle needled their faces. The MPs marched them down the muddy lane between compounds, boots squelching. Ahead, a low brick building hunched near the perimeter, a metal chimney coughing steam. The closer they came, the sharper the smell. Carbolic, damp cement, something metallic under it all. Inside the antechamber, the sound changed, echoes layering over each other, shouted orders from another room, the rattle of pipes, a steady drip, drip, drip. Bare light bulbs swung on cords from the rafters, buzzing faintly. "Undress," the taller MP said, gesturing at the hooks on the wall. "Clothes here, schnell. Delousing, shower, clean. Ja, camp regs, doctor's orders." There were no women in sight, no screens, just a half-open door through which Liesel glimpsed a row of shower heads jutting from a concrete wall, water hissing sporadically from one, pooling on the floor. Her throat tightened. The room tilted for a moment, shrinking around the nozzles and the drains. She saw, overlaid on the present, tiled Wehrmacht bathrooms, hands that had pushed her shoulder, eyes that had weighed her like meat. She heard rumors whispered in bunks about showers that meant smoke. A woman at the back began unbuttoning her dress with jerky fingers. Another muttered, "Do it, or they'll beat us." The tall MP shifted, uncomfortable. "Look, ladies, we ain't here for a show," he said in rough German. "We just gotta get you clean. Regulations." Liesel felt her chest hitch. Something hot and furious rose through the numbness. Before she could swallow it, words came out, sharp and clear. "We won't bathe in front of men." The English startled even her. The MPs blinked. The nearer one frowned. "What?" She lifted her chin, heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her gums. "We will not undress, not with men watching." A murmur rippled through the group, low at first, then stronger. "Ja, nicht für Männern," someone echoed. A chorus of agreement swelled, brittle but real. The tall MP's jaw worked. His hand shifted on the strap of his M1, the oiled leather squeaking. "Lady, I got orders," he said. "Schedule says you're in the showers at 1400. If you don't go quiet, I gotta make a report. And then it gets ugly." Liesel's knees wanted to fold. But behind her she could feel the press of bodies, the way the other women leaned into her words as if they were a wall. For once, their fear aligned with her own. She swallowed. "Then write," she said, voice fraying but unbroken. "Write that we refuse to be naked for you." The room held its breath. Somewhere in the pipes, air coughed. Water splattered harder for a moment. The MP stared at her, then at the line of women, at the shower room beyond. "Ah, hell," he muttered. "Wait here." He turned on his heel and strode out, boots striking sparks of sound off the concrete. The other MP stayed, shifting from foot to foot under the buzzing bulbs, caught between his rifle and the eyes of 20 women who had, for the first time in years, found a way to say no. Lieutenant Jack Ellery read the report twice before he swore. The words sat in black on onion skin paper. Female internees refused to disrobe in presence of male guards. Delousing incomplete. At the bottom, the medic's tight script. High risk of lice-borne disease if non-compliance continues. Rain ticked on the corrugated roof of the HQ hut. A drip had started in the corner overnight, tapping into a bucket with maddening regularity. Ellery rubbed his eyes, felt the grit there. The door opened without a knock. Sergeant Nolte slipped in first, shaking water from his jacket, followed by a man in a darker uniform with a small silver cross on his lapel and a worn Bible tucked under one arm. A woman trailed them, a Red Cross worker in a civilian coat with a white armband, her hair pinned back under a damp scarf. "Sir," Nolte said, "you wanted the chaplain." "I wanted somebody," Ellery muttered, then straightened. "Come in. Close the damn door." The chaplain offered a hand. "Captain Markham, Chaplain Corps," he said. "They said you had a situation." "It's not a riot," Ellery said. "Yet." He tapped the report with a knuckle. "We've got a pen full of women we picked up. Off a busted Wehrmacht convoy. Comfort girls, some of them. Paper says special case. Med says they're crawling. I try to run 'em through the shower line. They balk. Won't strip in front of my boys. The Red Cross woman's jaw tightened. Can you blame them? She asked softly. Ellery felt heat rise in his neck. Ma'am, Typhus doesn't give a damn about modesty. I've got regs, schedules, inspections. Another strike on my hygiene report, and some colonel in Frankfurt will be breathing down my neck. Nolte shifted. Captain Harris already says we're coddling the Krauts, he put in. Says we're going to forget who started this fight. The chaplain's gaze moved over the papers on the desk. Camp maps, supply lists, a mimeographed sheet stamped non-fraternization, strictly enforced. We're not asked to forget, he said. We are asked not to imitate. Ellery snorted, but it came out thinner than he meant. Images flickered in his mind. Newsreel footage of liberated camps, skeletal figures, stories of showers that were anything but. He pushed them away. What do you propose? He asked. I can't conjure up a ladies' bathhouse out of thin air. The Red Cross worker cleared her throat. There are church women in town, she said. They've been helping distribute parcels. Decent, proper women. And there are WACs at the railhead not far. If you asked for volunteers, they might supervise a more appropriate arrangement. Bring civilian women into a PW camp, Nolte said. Sir, that's unconventional, the chaplain finished. But not against any article I've read. Your non-fraternization order applies to your men, Lieutenant, not to basic charity. Rain hammered harder for a moment, drowning the room in noise. Ellery looked from the cross on the chaplain's chest to the Red Cross band on the woman's arm, to the ink bleeding slightly on the word refused in the report. If it keeps my camp clean and my name off some investigation, he said slowly, then maybe unconventional is the lesser headache. He picked up a pencil and circled the enclosure marked Women Special Case on the camp map. Fine, he said. Let's see if your church ladies can do what a squad of MPs couldn't. The decision hung there, a small, hard thing. Outside, a train whistle blew, long and low, as if the whole depot were answering. They arrived on a gray afternoon when the clouds hung so low it felt as if the wire might scrape them. The women in the barrack watched through the smeared window as a jeep rolled to a stop by the gate, followed by a canvas-sided truck. The drivers were the same olive-drab men as always, but when the tailgate dropped, it was women who climbed down. The first wore a uniform cut like a man's but fitted closer at the waist, skirt just below the knee, stockings disappearing, into low-lace shoes. Her service cap sat square on carefully pinned hair. A small gold-colored insignia gleamed on her lapel. Behind her came two older women in civilian coats and floral dresses, hems mud-spattered, cardigans buttoned crooked against the cold. Red Cross armbands ringed their sleeves. Amerikaner Anya breathed. They were herded into the women's compound by an MP who looked faintly embarrassed, as if he'd been asked to escort his mother into a bar. The WAC sergeant, Liesel guessed her rank from the stripes on her sleeve, paused, taking in the sagging barracks, the churned mud, the staring faces at the windows. Her mouth flattened, not with disgust, but something closer to anger held tight. They were brought into the barrack in a gust of cold air and wet wool. Up close, Liesel could smell coffee on their breath, a different soap on their skin, sharp, clean, unfamiliar. The WAC spoke first, her German careful but serviceable. We are here to help with bathing, privacy. She glanced at the MP. More proper. One of the churchwomen stepped forward, cheeks pink from the chill, hands red from work. She smiled, wide and awkward, not quite knowing where to rest her eyes. In her arms, she carried a wooden crate. She set it on a bunk and opened it to show bars of soap, rough and yellowed, and a mason jar half full of cloudy, congealed fat. The women in the bunks leaned closer despite themselves. Soap was as valuable as bread. Through a camp interpreter borrowed from another enclosure, the churchwoman spoke, her words tumbling, then slowing as she realized how many eyes were on her. "After harvest," she said, nodding, miming cutting with an invisible knife, "we save the fat from the hogs. We boil it with lye. It smells terrible at first, but then—" She picked up one of the bars, held it under her own nose, inhaled. "Good. Clean." Liesel watched the mason jar in her hands. It was the same kind of jar her mother had once used to keep cherries in syrup in a tiny cellar in Essen. The memory rose so sharply she tasted sugar and dust on her tongue. Mrs. McKay, someone had said her name at the door, saw her shiver. She crossed the narrow aisle between bunks, moving slowly enough to be refused. When Liesel didn't move, she took her hand, turned it palm up. The American's fingers were warm, the skin chapped and roughened by work, not soft at all. She pressed a bar of soap into Liesel's palm. "For Sie," she said, in clumsy German. "For you." The smell was strong, harsh with lye, but there was something almost sweet beneath it. Fat, smoke, some ghost of the animal it had been. Liesel's throat closed. For a heartbeat, the woman's kitchen, the boiling pot, the line of jars on a shelf existed alongside her mother's, layered over each other like two transparencies. These were the enemy's women, from posters and speeches and all the stories told in dim bunk rooms. Yet here one stood, blushing, smelling of coffee and pig fat and wet wool, offering her a piece of cleanliness made from work and leftover scraps. The world did not right itself, but it tilted, just enough to make her reach out, fingers closing around the course bar. Outside, the rain eased. Somewhere, a whistle blew for evening roll call. Inside the barrack, no one moved for a long moment, caught between old stories and the new, confusing sight of women from another war standing in the doorway with soap and mason jars instead of rifles. The bathhouse looked different the next morning, but only if you knew where to look. Canvas had been strung from wires and pipe, sagging slightly to form rough cubicles along one wall. The tarpaulins smelled of old tents and engine exhaust. Between them, gaps still yawned where the wind could poke its fingers through, but at least the nozzles were no longer the only thing you saw when you stepped inside. Ellery stood just inside the doorway, arms folded, helmet pushed back a fraction. The medic hovered at his elbow, clipboard ready. "Typhus doesn't care about curtains," the medic muttered. "People do," Ellery said under his breath. The wax sergeant, her name was Miller, he'd learned, was already moving along the walls, tugging at ropes, testing knots. Mrs. McKay and the other churchwoman stacked folded GI towels on a bench, thin, rough things stamped U.S. in black ink near the hem. Steam drifted from the far culvert where extra hot water hissed through a jury-rigged pipe. Outside, the women waited in a knot, arms wrapped around themselves despite their coats. Liesel could see only the tips of the shower heads over the canvas, like metal flowers in a strange garden. Her hand still smelled faintly of the lye soap Mrs. McKay had given her. She'd unwrapped and wrapped it again in a scrap of cloth until the edges began to round. Miller stepped out to face them. "Listen," she said in German that had grown less stiff overnight. "Today, screens, only women inside. One guard at the door. You keep towel around you, yes? Fast as we can." She glanced at the medic. "For sickness." From the back, a GI snorted. "What is this, a curtain show?" he said to his buddy, not quietly enough. Miller turned her head. "Private. Unless you plan on catching lice for them, you can clear out of my line of sight," she said crisply in English. The MP at the door hid a smile. Some of the German women shifted, skepticism carved deep into their faces. "They say that. Then the men come anyway," one muttered. "Always the same." Liesel's stomach fluttered. She believed that voice. It had been right too many times, but she also remembered the mason jar, Mrs. McKay's rough hands. The world had tilted, just enough that she could imagine something slightly different. Not safe, but less dangerous. Without warning, Miller stepped back into the bathhouse, walked to the first shower head, and turned the handle. Water spat, then came in a thin, steady stream. She rolled her sleeves to the elbow, revealing forearms as pale and goose-pimpled as any girl's, and stepped fully under the spray in her uniform blouse and skirt. The shock on her face was brief and genuine. "Verdammt kalt," she gasped, then laughed, the sound echoing off the tile. "See?" she called, switching to German. "Same water, same cold. I go first." The absurdity of the straight-backed American sergeant standing drenched, cap askew, skirt clinging to her stockings, cracked something in the room. A brittle laugh slipped from someone's throat, then was quickly smothered. Liesel felt her own mouth twitch against her will. If this was a performance, it was one that cost the performer something. Mrs. McKay appeared at her elbow, holding out a towel and one of the rough soap bars. "Come with me," she said, the German broken but earnest. "We keep eyes at the floor, ja? Only women." The pipes hissed. Canvas flapped softly in a draft. Liesel looked at the door, at the single MP facing outward now, back to them, and then at the soaked, shivering sergeant standing under the spray as if she could absorb the shock for them. Her feet moved before her doubts could catch up. She stepped forward, into the damp warmth of the bathhouse, the smell of carbolic and lye and wet wool closing around her like a new, still untrustworthy skin. The second day of showers went faster. Women moved in pairs behind the canvas, clutching towels, emerging with hair slicked flat and cheeks pink from the cold. The wax sergeant barked instructions. Mrs. McKay hummed tunelessly as she refilled basins and wrung out cloths. It should have felt like victory. Instead, as Liesel stepped back into the yard, hair dripping into the collar of her dress, she felt eyes on her like grit. Frau Hartmann, who had once run the dormitory of a girls' school and still held herself like a headmistress, stood near the barrack door, arms folded so tightly her knuckles blanched. "So," Hartmann said, voice carrying, "some of us are very quick to please the enemy." The words hit harder than any slap. A few women who had refused the showers nodded, drawing closer to Hartmann's hard certainty. Others looked away, caught between shame at their own relief and resentment at the implication. Liesel felt the towel around her shoulders become suddenly conspicuous, almost indecent. "We went because of lice," she said, but it came out thin. "Because of sickness." Hartmann's gaze was sharp as broken glass. "They touch you with their eyes, or with water. It is all the same. You will have nothing left that is yours." For a moment, Liesel wanted to tell her that nothing left had happened long before the Americans arrived. At Essen, at the Sonderheim, under field gray tunics, not olive drab ones. The words rose, then died. There was no safe direction to throw them. Later, from inside the barrack, she heard raised voices from the HQ hut across the wire. The rain had started again, streaking the windows, but sound carried oddly in the damp air. A harsher American voice cut through, angry, clipped. "Pampering them, Ellery. These aren't refugees. They're whores who kept your buddies busy while they shelled us. You run a PW camp, not a finishing school." Silence. Then Ellery's reply, lower, harder to catch. Only fragments reached her. Geneva. Inspection. Disease figures. That evening, a medic came to their compound with a different expression. He moved from bunk to bunk, checking foreheads, prodding bellies. In the far corner, Anya lay curled, face gray, sweat darkening her hairline. The medic pressed his lips together, then scribbled quickly on his pad. From the doorway, Liesel saw the paper he handed to the MP. Two thin sheets with carbon smudges, lines of type already visible even before the top one bent. Somewhere at the bottom, a box labeled Remarks had been filled with tight letters. Temperature spikes in women's enclosure, he said. If we don't complete the delousing protocol, and soon, this whole camp will be a fever ward. The next morning, a new notice went up on the bulletin board outside HQ, pinned under the existing non-fraternization circular. Liesel couldn't read the English, but she heard the summary from a Polish interpreter. More inspections, no excuses, no delays. Back in the barrack, water dripped steadily from the roof into a metal bucket. Each hollow ping sounded like a countdown. Trust had not protected her from suspicion, and defiance had not freed her from protocols. She sat on the edge of her bunk, towel still folded in her lap, and understood that the next time they were marched to the bathhouse, there would be less patience on every side. May 3rd, 1945. The date was stamped at the top of the new order, along with words the interpreter translated with a flat voice. Full medical inspection. Female internees. No exceptions. They were marched to the bathhouse in silence. The sky was the same low pewter as always, but something in the way the MPs walked, more rigid, hands closer to their rifles, made the air feel thinner. Liesel's stomach twisted with each step on the wet gravel. Inside, the antechamber was already crowded. A major in a crisp medical uniform stood by a trestle table, stethoscope looped around his neck, metal tags on strings laid out in rows beside a bottle of clear disinfectant. His boots shone, absurdly bright against the damp concrete. Lutz Ellery hovered near the wall, helmet off, hair flattened where the liner had sat. Beside him, Sergeant Miller and Mrs. McKay waited, their presence strangely small against the bulk of the MPs and the big-shouldered major. The canvas screen still hung inside, but the order, pinned to the wall, spoke louder. "We are behind schedule for delousing," the major said, his German stiff but intelligible. "Typhus has broken out in other camps. We will not have that here. Clothes off, showers, medical tags, finished." The pipes hissed. Somewhere beyond the doorway, water already ran, a steady, indifferent sound. No one moved. A woman near Liesel began to cry quietly, both hands locked around the front of her dress. Another stared fixedly at the floorboards, lips moving in a prayer Liesel half remembered from childhood. An MP took one step forward, lifting his hand toward the hooks on the wall. "Let's go, ladies," he said. "We ain't got all day." The room shrank. Liesel saw again the bare light bulbs, the shower heads, the drains, heard Hartmann's voice, the captain's contempt, the medic's warning about fever. Whatever happened next would fix itself in memory, hard and sharp. Her throat was dry, but the words were already there, waiting. "We won't bathe in front of men." This time, when she spoke, she felt the echo of the first refusal, but also its consequences. Her voice shook, but she held the major's gaze. "Not with men watching, but we know about sickness. We will not refuse that." For a moment, there was only the drip of water and the faint squeak of leather as soldiers shifted. The major opened his mouth, ready to roar. Ellery cut across him. "Sir," he said quickly, "we have female personnel on site. WAC sergeant and civilian volunteers. Screens in place. We can clear the men from the room. Keep one guard at the door. Still meet your schedule." The major hesitated, annoyance battling calculation. Typhus did not care who watched whom. "One guard only," he said at last. "Door closed. I want every woman tagged by 1600. Ellery nodded once, sharp. He jerked his chin at the MPs. "Out. You, Jenkins. Post on the door." Back turned. Mrs. McKay moved first, carrying towels. Miller followed, shoulders squared. As the last helmet disappeared into the yard and the door shut with a heavy thud, the air seemed to loosen by a fraction. Miller stepped to the nearest hook, hanging a towel there herself. "You lead them. she said quietly to Liesel, in German roughened by cold and effort. You know their fear. I know the pipes. Liesel's heart hammered. This was still a surrender of skin, of privacy. But it was also, for the first time, hers to offer, not to have taken. She turned to the women, voice low but carrying. We go behind the screens, she said. Only women. We get clean. We live. We do not let them decide what this means. One by one, feet scraped on concrete, buttons slipped through holes, canvas rippled as figures passed behind it. The water's hiss grew louder, joined by gasps, then the soft slap of bare soles. When Liesel finally stepped under the spray, lye soap stinging her cracked hands, she heard the echo of her own words from weeks before and from moments ago. They did not cancel each other. They simply existed. Two refusals reshaped into something that, for once, felt almost like a choice. By evening, the steam had thinned, leaving the bathhouse smelling of cold stone and old soap. The last of the women shuffled back toward the barracks, hair braided damp, towels clutched tight. The door to the shower room stood half open, letting out a faint, steady drip. Liesel lingered at the threshold, fingers grazing the rough wood. Her skin felt scraped clean, almost unfamiliar under the thin dress. The lye had left a fine sting along the backs of her hands, like a memory that refused to fade. Inside, Mrs. McKay was on her knees. Her coat was thrown over a pipe. The floral dress she wore was darker at the hem, where water had soaked it. In both hands she gripped a stiff, bristled brush, working it back and forth across a patch of concrete already pale with foam. Her movements were methodical, shoulders rounding and straightening, breath puffing white in the cooling air. A small radio sat on the trestle table, its cloth speaker grill stained at one corner. An American voice crackled through in bursts, half swallowed by static. Unconditional surrender. Victory in Europe. The English words brushed Liesel's ears without sinking in, like raindrops on glass. On the wall above the table, a fresh Red Cross bulletin fluttered, corners curling away from the tack. There was a photograph, lines of prisoners behind wire, not here but somewhere else, captioned in English and French. Mrs. McKay paused to dip the brush into a bucket of water gone cloudy with soap and dirt. She flexed her fingers once, shaking them as if to fling away the ache, then set the bristles to the floor again. Without thinking it through, Liesel stepped inside. Her footsteps made small, wet sounds. Mrs. McKay glanced up, surprise widening her eyes, then softened into something like a question. Liesel held out a hand. Geben Sie, she said quietly. Give. For a second, the older woman hesitated, fingers tightening on the handle. Then she smiled, tired, crooked, and surrendered the brush. The wood was warm from her grip. Liesel knelt where she had been, skirts picking up the damp. When she pushed the bristles across the concrete, the resistance bit up through her wrist and into her shoulder. The motion was familiar in a way she hadn't expected. She had scrubbed floors once, before uniforms and orders and house rules, before her body became something negotiated rather than owned. Beside her, Mrs. McKay sank down with a soft, involuntary groan, rubbing at one knee. She reached for the bucket, steadying it as Liesel worked. Together, the American said, in halting German. Zusammen, ja? Liesel nodded. Her throat was too tight for words. They scrubbed in silence, the brush rasping uneven. Strokes. Soap stung the shallow cracks on Liesel's knuckles. She watched the dirty foam swirl away toward the drain, carrying with it sweat, skin, and the film of the day. Above the radio's murmur of victory and maps, there was only the sound of two women breathing in time. For a moment, the war narrowed to the width of the path they cleaned, side by side on the hard floor, hands marked by different kinds of work and the same thin red line of irritation from lie. It was not forgiveness or absolution. It was simply proof that there was something they could do that was not enduring or being endured. When they finally straightened, groaning softly, a patch of the concrete gleamed darker, rinsed, and new. Liesel wiped the back of her wrist across her forehead and realized, with a jolt, that in this small, stupid task she had not felt like inventory or category or shame. Just tired. Just human. Outside, someone laughed in another language. The radio voice spoke again of surrender. In the bathhouse, the only thing that mattered was that for a little while, her hands and the enemy woman's hands had done the same, simple thing. The wire looked different in June. Grass had begun to push up against the base of the fence, stubborn and small. The sentry in the nearest tower leaned on the rail more often now, helmet tipped back, rifle slung loose. Sometimes Liesel could hear birds louder than boots. Orders came folded in triplicate, like everything else. One morning an MP arrived with a clipboard and a list of names, reading them out in clumsy German. Some women were marked for transfer to German-run facilities for screening. Others were to be released to nearby towns under local authority. No one quite knew which was kinder. Denazification, Anya said, tasting the foreign word. They will ask who believed what, who did what, as if it were so simple. On her bunk, Liesel folded her few belongings into the same scuffed suitcase she had carried from the Sonderheim, a change of underclothes, a mended dress, a comb missing 2 teeth. At the bottom, her fingers brushed paper, thin, foreign, rough at the edges. She drew out a scrap of brown wrapping, folded around something small and hard. Inside lay a bar of soap, no bigger than her palm, shaved down at the corners by use. The scent rose immediately, harsh, lye, animal fat, a faint memory of smoke. It was the same smell that clung to the bathhouse, to Mrs. McKay's hands, to the concrete they had scrubbed together. For an instant, the odor twisted her stomach, tangled as it was with nakedness and orders and the cold slap of water. Then another layer came through. Kitchens, cellars, cherries in jars, the ordinary labor of women who boiled what was left and made something useful out of it. She closed her hand around the soap until the edges bit into her skin. The Americans had called her internee, special case. The Germans would have other names ready. None of them fit cleanly. At the far end of the barrack, someone laughed at a joke Liesel couldn't hear. Outside, a GI's radio crackled with news in fast English. Tribunals, reconstruction, zones. Somewhere, trains were running again. Civilians counted and sorted and sent along tracks under Allied schedules. "Where will you go?" Anya asked from the next bunk, voice small. Liesel looked at the soap in her hand. "Home," she said, though she did not know what remained of Essen. "Or somewhere that pretends to be home." She slipped the bar back into the wrapping, tucking it between her folded clothes. Not as a keepsake of kindness, exactly, or of suffering, but as proof that the same world that had stripped her bare could also, in small, clumsy ways, try to cover her again. When they were finally led toward the gate, the wire humming softly in the early summer heat, Liesel didn't look back at the bathhouse. She carried its smell with her, in her suitcase and on her skin, into whatever waited beyond the tracks and the questions and the new sets of eyes. It was not absolution. It was not justice. It was the start of a life in which enemies had faces and hands and smells she would never forget, and in which she would have to decide again and again what to do with that knowledge.